For the original Metroid, Samus Aran served little other purpose than to be a vessel for the player. As such, the manual explaining the game's story leaves her character shrouded in mystery simply because there wasn't much character to keep hidden. She's a badass taking on the entire planet of Zebes by herself, and that was all you needed. This is the depiction that Retro Studios would adapt into the Metroid Prime games, where Samus is described as a prophesized hero in Chozo lore. The Federation see her as either a celebrity or an urban myth, and space pirates fear her very presence. There's a bit of character you can glean from these games, but that character is rarely if ever the focus, and it's easy to just call her a Doom Girl and leave her at that without losing much of the story. That's not to say that this is necessarily a bad thing, as a powerful, confident, self-actualized protagonist works very well for a power fantasy action game, but Metroid has always had a foot in horror as well, where any power only serves to hamper the experience. I might piss myself at the sight of a Metroid, but Samus Aran sure as hell wouldn't, and if she's not scared about this, then why should I be? Prime 2 Echoes was particularly bad about this, showing Samus to be calm, collected, and in control of the situation, even at the start of the game, when the player should be feeling scared, stripped of their power, and stranded on an alien world. But also, the simplicity and staticity of Prime Samus goes against the theme of growth that often comes bundled with Metroidvania. You might feel like you've grown by the end of the game, but Samus is still the same person she was at the start. But more than that, this interpretation ignores what character she does have. Fusion shows her as more reserved and introspective than just plain silent and deadly, and her sparing of the baby in Return of Samus is a defining moment for her character, and a choice that hints towards some beliefs or emotions she acts on. And then there's her past, from the deaths of her parents, childhood with the Chozo, and time serving in the Federation army before becoming a hunter, all of which imply a character with a rich past that informs their actions. Samus may have begun life as your run-of-the-mill stoic protagonist, and that might still be the common perception of her by more casual fans, but she clearly has a depth and potential for character under the surface of Nintendo's later games that I feel is often ignored. And I wonder if this is how Yoshio Sakamoto felt after working as a content advisor on the Prime series. Being the director of games like Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion, he believed that the Prime games led people to have different ideas about who Samus was, and so he wanted to create a game which properly defined her character. That was the motive behind Metroid Other M, to determine and express what kind of human Samus Aran is, so that we can really tell what kind of natural steps she should be taking in the future. Other M was a controversial game. It was a passable Ninja Gaiden, but it's better known as a train wreck of a story in a series where story was largely viewed as irrelevant. It dared to explore the character of one of gaming's most iconic heroines, but to many, it fell flat on its face, reducing Samus to a scared child, a mess monologuing about motherhood, and an independent bounty hunter severely lacking in independence. As a result, Other M is possibly the most hated game Nintendo have ever had the misfortune to publish, and its negative reception is believed to be the main reason the series lay mostly dormant for 6 years. Just about every Metroid fan has called for Nintendo to denounce the game and leave it behind to be forgotten. And yet, Nintendo have never really done that. In fact, they seem to have been doing the opposite. Team Ninja, who were in charge of the gameplay, would reference the game in Dead or Alive Dimensions only a year later, and would later work with Nintendo on several Dynasty Warriors spin-offs. But Nintendo themselves would re-release the game on the Wii U as a part of a fairly small selection of otherwise great Wii games, and it would be used as the basis for Samus' representation in subsequent Smash Bros. Games. All the while Sakamoto, the man blamed and reviled for everything wrong with the game, is still working on the series, and was partly responsible for Samus' return in 2017. And of course, despite the infamy of the game, Nintendo have never said anything about the accusations of blatant sexism leveled at it. In fact, looking at how they've treated it, they almost seem to be proud of it. But how could they? There couldn't be anything in Other M they'd want to be proud of. Right? Return of Samus is the first time that Samus shows some depth of character. The Federation tasks her with exterminating all Metroids on their home planet, which she accomplishes with little apparent apprehension. However, when an infant Metroid hatches before her eyes and latches onto her as its mother, Samus elects to disobey her orders and spares the Metroid, taking it with her as she flees the planet. Super Metroid makes her motive behind this clear in its subtext. Meridia has 2 instances of local fauna displaying a parental connection, and Sarah's space colony, where she takes the baby, is named after the Roman goddess of, among other things, motherhood. But whatever her reason, the act establishes that Samus, even when working for others, plays by her own rules. Fusion would later double down on this conflict with authority. Samus claims early on that she doesn't like taking orders, and the game does a pretty good job justifying this when it's revealed that the AI giving her orders throughout the game has been working to keep her in the dark about the Federation's dirty dealings. But it isn't as cut and dry as authority bad. Adam Malkovich was introduced into the series in Metroid Fusion as Samus' former commanding officer. In reminiscing about him, she describes him as dignified, a perfect military mind, and more personally, relentless in his criticism, but he always cared. He is revealed to have sacrificed his life for Samus in the past, and she has such a respect for him that she nicknames the AI after him. As it turns out, that AI is Adam, or at least his mind backed up and running on artificial intelligence. So when Samus is willing to throw her life away in desperation, Adam's guidance helps her destroy the X-Parasites aboard the BSL while also saving her life. For a character who doesn't like taking orders and the main game to depict the major authorities as untrustworthy, it's strange that the story is resolved not by Samus's rebellious nature, but by the guidance of another authority figure. This is the character that the subsequently released Prime games would largely disregard. There is an implication in Prime 2 echoes of a sexist culture in the ranks of the Federation Marines, however. Specialist Angseth, the only female trooper shown in the entire series, laments, "I can outshoot half the men here and I'm stuck on monitor duty. I didn't join up just to stare at a holoscreen." While another trooper, Private Craney, seems to describe her as emotional for believing in fairy tales like Samus or Bigfoot or Santa Claus. Angseth being the only confirmed woman among the troopers also seems to be intentional, as it stands in sharp contrast with the relatively mixed representation of the Luminoth, where the corpses strewn around the planet are male and female alike, and the Sentinels are just about evenly split. Ultimately though, the depiction of the Federation still feels like you're supposed to respect them. Samus quietly mourns their deaths, and says Private Bruda, "Know that we did our duty and fought well." But Prime 3 corruption would turn those muddy waters into a swamp. Not only does the game have basically no critique towards the Federation that one might expect from the series so far, but Samus spends most of the game following the orders of the Federation's Aurora unit or Admiral Dane, a direct contradiction of Fusion where it stated she had only ever followed Adam's orders before then. And yet, Samus displays no grievance about any of this, despite the fact that her character would logically be at least grumbling the entire way, and the fact that Corruption is the only game in the trilogy to really highlight her inner thoughts when it comes to her fellow hunters. The Prime games ultimately depict a fairly boring relationship between Samus and the Federation, telling a story where she does what she's told because it needs doing. But while it isn't completely illogical for her, it's ultimately a story that doesn't fit tonally with the games that came before them, and leads to her character getting muddled overall. So if Sakamoto wanted to tell a story about Samus, he would have to reconcile these two conflicting interpretations. How could someone who claims to be a lone rebellious hunter also be such a loyal lapdog to the Federation? Hopefully, with that brief overview of the plot, you can see how Other M's themes of sexism and motherhood are intended as a continuation of themes the series has toyed with before, and not Sakamoto grasping at the most obvious theme to do with femininity. With that said, Other M is easily the most overt these themes have been so far. Samus reveals that she felt discriminated against during her time in the Federation. Her garish power suit sets her apart from the muted colors of the redesigned Federation armor of her male squadron, and even the level design itself seems to draw attention to her gender. This is really the first time we can tell Samus feels ostracized because of her sex, rather than the reading between the lines I had to do in Echoes. And of course, you're likely familiar with just how overbearing the game is about motherhood in its opening minutes alone, but I would argue that serves to establish Samus' mental state. She's just lost a child of sorts, and it's easy for me to imagine her thoughts being drawn to it, even after the unspecific amount of time that followed since Super Metroid. But interesting to me is the story of Madeline and Melissa. This plot is kind of forgettable due to being almost entirely dumped right before the final boss, but it's the main story you're trying to figure out throughout the game, and probably the most complete instance of the theme of motherhood. But there's another purpose in my eyes. I think Melissa is intended as a parallel to Samus. Both were raised as weapons, with Ridley explicitly describing Samus as the Chozo's bioweapon in the 2004's Metroid manga, and both are characterized as rebellious. But interestingly, Madeline theorizes that Melissa developing emotions was likely brought on by exposure to the Metroids. Samus even conjectures that Melissa developed a soul as a Metroid imprinted on her, and seems to latch onto the idea. Under this interpretation, this implies that Samus sparing the baby wasn't just what she would have done normally, but is a transformational moment for her character. Before this, in the original Metroid, the Prime games, and even Return of Samus up to that point, she honestly displays very little in the way of personal agency. The Federation then were a benevolent force of good for whom she'd gladly work alongside. Any who would go against them can only be evil, idiotic, or corrupted. But after this moment, the baby awakens something within her. Maybe it's a parental instinct she didn't know was there, or a sudden moral revelation. And after a period of reminiscing and self-reflection on Zebes, she becomes much more critical of the Federation, remembering her own experience working more closely with them and witnessing their secretive operations on both the bottle ship and the BSL. And so we finally see her acting on her own judgment, even against the will of the Federation. Because of this, the fact that the chronologically earlier games feel so tonally different is directly addressed and explained rather than being brushed aside or retconned. They're not wrong to depict Samus as unflinchingly loyal to the Federation, or the Federation as unilaterally good, because it isn't a definitive depiction of Samus, the Federation, or the series as a whole. They're just one moment in the ongoing story of the series and a snapshot of how Samus is thinking at that moment. So, in that sense, I actually think Other M is a pretty decent extension of the series. It tackles the same themes as the game so far, even going as far as to answer a question of continuity that could be seen as a problem. But ultimately, that's not what this game is about. Other M is undoubtedly a game about Adam. Many of the flashbacks in the game revolve around Samus' time with him in the Federation army, and while the main plot is arguably what happened on the bottle ship, the moment with the most dramatic weight and the one with the biggest impact on the overall plot is Adam's death, in which he sacrifices himself so that Samus wouldn't do the same. The same event, though, would inspire her to nearly give her life in Fusion. In this respect, Other M appears to be a straight-faced depiction of this heroic figure, with Samus coming to terms with her younger self who acted more rebelliously towards him, and learning to truly respect him as a hero and a martyr. However, as many have noticed, he isn't as heroic as these dramatics would have you believe. The best example is that as a consequence of Adam taking a commanding role over Samus, he assumes control over what suit features she can use, while he discerns which would be safe to use in a space station that likely has survivors wandering around. This might make sense on first glance, as Samus's arsenal has some very destructive capabilities, but there are many points where Samus refuses to use equipment that only allows her to move throughout the facility or protect her from damage or death, while providing little to no offensive capability. Furthermore, there are hints that this isn't entirely just Adam being cautious. His crew's freeze guns and Anthony's plasma beam are authorized almost immediately, while it takes him a substantial amount of time to authorize each of those for Samus. And that's not even mentioning the time he locks her in a room with enemies to deny her help from the rest of the crew, or the time he shoots her in the back and leaves her in danger of a Metroid for half a minute for seemingly no good reason, only to give her a non-answer explaining himself when she wakes up. Despite the heroic light the game frames him in, Adam doesn't seem to be a person deserving of it. However, perhaps more interesting is Samus's place in the relationship. Following the orders of a Federation commander she trusts isn't hard to believe for her, but her attitude feels completely unwarranted for this relationship. She regales him with praise in her inner monologue, always musing over his opinions on a situation, even berating herself for one time that she questioned his judgment, as if her rebellious self is something to be ashamed of. Samus even restricts her arsenal before Adam tells her to do anything of the sort, and yet, before any explicit command to restrict herself or knowledge that she already did, he authorizes missile use, implying that he has already taken a commanding role over her, and that he knows she has already given that control to him. Even his catchphrase, "Any objections, lady?" is Adam acknowledging that Samus won't disobey his orders, his way of noting our trust. What Other M is describing here is almost unmistakably an abusive relationship. Adam orders Samus around, willfully putting her in dangerous situations, even verbally demeaning her, all the while Samus goes along with it, ignoring his questionable actions, blaming herself for ever questioning his judgment, and in the end, worshipping him as a martyr. And yet, worst of all, the conclusion this game seems to come to is that this is a good thing. Samus should be subservient, and should respect the man with control over her. That's what this game is trying to say. Or is it? Let me take a moment to examine the use of Ridley in Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. In the game's early section on Nohrian, Ridley's presence is hinted at. He flies overhead, attacking you along the way, and you're eventually caught off guard and interrupted at the end of a task to fight him. In the fight, with the two of you plummeting down a shaft in the center of the planet, you're often grabbed and restricted, only able to attack Ridley's hands to prevent him from attacking you. And when the fight is over, you're saved by a male comrade and continue along your way. You're victorious, sure, but there's a weakness implied that makes the fight ever so slightly unsatisfying. The second fight on the pirate homeworld provides that satisfaction, where before he caught you off guard, you're now making your way to him. You were trapped in place, but now you're free to move as you see fit. You had maybe 2 items to your name back then, but now you've got all but 1. This fight is a damn good conclusion of this arc, and it's a great example of how important Ridley is to the Metroid series, as fighting him always feels like an appropriate bookend to Samus's growth. This is why it's surprising that Other M, despite being decried as unfaithful, especially to the Prime series, mostly hits the nail on the head. His presence is foreshadowed by the introduction of Little Birdie before you're attacked by its grown form, and just like in Corruption, this fight has you caught off guard, pinned in place, only able to deflect Ridley's attacks, and you end the fight being saved by the male comrade. And again, the second fight has you powered up and fighting on your own terms. In fact, this fight arguably outdoes Corruption by having tracking down the monster be your goal throughout most of the game up to the fight, and even better connecting the two fights by having you encounter the beast's husk both times and calling back to Anthony saving Samus in the first fight. I'm not surprised that this moment is what's so often referenced about this game by Team Ninja and Nintendo, as it's easily one of the best fights in the entire series. But crucially, it doesn't end there. After Ridley appears to die, he flies off, and you're left with that same feeling of discontentment as the first fight. After all, not only does Samus break down in front of Ridley before the fight, but in doing so also indirectly causes Anthony's death. And in Adam's final moments, he still orders you to find and kill Ridley, the game essentially promising that third fight. And yet, it never comes. Ridley is killed off screen by the Queen Metroid. This is just one example of a strange trend with the game. Plotlines are introduced and developed competently, and in the case of Ridley, with clear indication that the game knows what it's doing, and yet they never seem to conclude in a satisfying way. The deleter, after killing most of the squad and causing Samus to suspect 2 of her closest acquaintances, is unceremoniously killed off screen in such a way that people didn't even realize James was the deleter. The plot of what happened on the bottle ship, central to the game as it seems to be, is concluded by Madeline and the Federation soldiers shooting Melissa and Anthony saving Madeline from being taken away. The most Samus does is aim at Melissa and get berated when she tries to do so much as talk to Madeline. And most obviously, and yet also most overlooked, that closing shot of Samus learning to finally respect her abusive CO is cut off by a quite literal no, with the game almost explicitly saying, there is something more to be said here. This is not the conclusion. And man, that's not even talking about Anthony's role in the story. Samus hyperanalyzes Adam's every word for calling her lady, but Anthony calling her an arguably more infantilizing name is just something he does. He's also one of the few people in the series Samus herself jokes around with, and he seems to be close enough to her that he can prompt her to open up about her past. Even on a meta level, not only does he predict Adam's death, but is the one who ultimately saves the day, coming out on top of even the corrupt Federation colonel. As such, his interjection implies that he can tell what she's thinking, and he doesn't like it, but also sounds as a statement that this isn't the whole story. I think that's the point of Other M. It's an anticlimax. It tells a story with the express purpose of leaving it unfinished. It takes Samus's character, drags it through the dirt, and leaves it there, but lets us know that somehow and at some point, she'll dig her way back on top. Maybe in another game that takes place after Fusion, Samus and the rogue Adam AI will rebel against the Federation for good, and maybe in doing so, Samus will get a better view of her relationship with Adam. Ultimately, what happens in this series is for Nintendo to decide, or greenlight, but Other M gives them a fairly good idea of where they should go, and after all, that was the whole point of making the game. To determine and express what kind of human Samus Aran is, so that we can really tell what kind of natural steps she should be taking in the future. That is, at least what I see, as the secret to this game. That is the fact that it explains a lot of its faults, and sure, it's by no means an amazing, perfect game, but it's interesting enough to have given me 10 years to think about it, and bold enough that it fits right in with some of the best Metroid games. And honestly, that's why I like Other M.